The Netherlands is often remembered for resistance, hiding places, and survival stories. But there is another truth, one that is harder to face. In 1943, the Nazis built a full SS concentration camp on Dutch soil. Not a transit camp, not a prison, a true concentration camp run by the SS, designed to break people completely. Men, women, and children were imprisoned here. Some survived. Many did not. This was Camp Vught, and for more than a year, it became a place where humanity was systematically destroyed in the heart of Western Europe. Before it became a symbol of suffering, Camp Vught was just land. Flat fields near the village of Vught in the south of the Netherlands. The area lay close to the city of 's-Hertogenbosch, surrounded by farms, trees, and quiet roads. Nothing in the landscape suggested that it would soon become the only SS concentration camp built in Western Europe outside Nazi Germany itself. What happened here between 1943 and 1944 would leave deep scars in Dutch history, scars that are still felt today. When Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, the occupation began quickly and brutally. At first, many Dutch citizens hoped life might continue with limited interference. That illusion did not last. Jewish citizens were gradually isolated, stripped of rights, and marked. Political opponents, resistance members, Roma and Sinti, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and others labelled undesirable were arrested. By 1941 and 1942, deportations to camps in Eastern Europe had begun. The Dutch transit camp Westerbork became the main hub for deportations, but the German authorities wanted a camp closer to industrial areas and better controlled by the SS. That decision led directly to the creation of Camp Vught. Construction began in 1942. The camp was designed according to the same principles as German concentration camps. Rows of wooden barracks, watchtowers, barbed wire fences charged with electricity, and strict separation between prisoners and guards. Forced labourers, many of them prisoners themselves, helped build the camp under harsh conditions. Even before it officially opened, suffering had already begun. Camp Vught was not an extermination camp like Auschwitz or Sobibor, but that distinction does not mean it was less brutal. It functioned as a concentration camp, a labour camp, a transit camp, and a prison, all at once. Prisoners were sent here to be punished, exploited, broken, or prepared for deportation further east. Violence, hunger, fear, and humiliation were constant. The camp officially opened in January 1943. From the start, it was overcrowded. Barracks meant for a few hundred people often held far more. Sanitation was poor. Food was insufficient and deliberately inadequate. Prisoners lived on watery soup, small amounts of bread, and occasional scraps. Malnutrition weakened them quickly, making them more vulnerable to disease and abuse. The SS guards who ran the camp were trained to rule through terror. Beatings were common and often arbitrary. Prisoners could be punished for looking the wrong way, standing too slowly, or failing to understand shouted German orders. Collective punishment was frequently used. If one prisoner was accused of breaking a rule, an entire barrack might suffer. Camp Vught held a wide range of prisoners. Jews made up a large part of the population, including men, women, and children. Many Jewish prisoners were only held temporarily before being deported to extermination camps. Political prisoners, such as members of the Dutch resistance, were also imprisoned here. They were often subjected to harsher treatment, interrogation, and isolation. Roma and Sinti families were imprisoned as well, reflecting the broader genocidal policies of the Nazi regime. There were also common criminals, hostages, and people arrested for minor acts of defiance. One of the most striking aspects of Camp Vught was that families were sometimes imprisoned together. This was unusual compared to many other camps. Children lived behind barbed wire, surrounded by violence and fear. Some children were born in the camp, others watched their parents be beaten or taken away, never to return. The psychological damage inflicted on these children would last a lifetime. Forced labor was central to life in Camp Vught. Prisoners were forced to work long hours under brutal conditions. Some labored inside the camp, repairing buildings or performing exhausting manual tasks. Others were sent to factories outside the camp, including facilities producing equipment for the German war effort. Refusal to work, slowing down, or collapsing from exhaustion could result in severe punishment or death. The command structure of the camp ensured that cruelty flowed from the top down. The camp commandant and SS officers enforced strict discipline and encouraged violence. Some guards took personal pleasure in abusing prisoners. Others followed orders mechanically, but the result was the same. The system was designed to strip prisoners of dignity, identity, and hope. Fear was constant. Roll calls could last for hours, regardless of weather. Prisoners stood motionless while guards counted and recounted them, sometimes deliberately prolonging the process as punishment. In winter, people froze. In summer, they collapsed from heat and thirst. If the numbers did not match, roll call could continue indefinitely. Punishments in Camp Vught were severe and often deadly. Prisoners could be locked in tiny cells, beaten until unconscious, or forced to stand for hours in stress positions. Executions took place both inside and outside the camp. Some prisoners were shot. Others died from injuries, disease, or sheer exhaustion. Death became an expected presence. One of the most infamous events in Camp Vught's history would later become known as the bunker tragedy. But even before that moment, the camp had already established itself as a place of extreme cruelty. The SS bunker, a punishment building with small cells, symbolized the absolute power guards held over prisoners' lives. Being sent there often meant severe suffering and sometimes death. Despite the terror, resistance did exist within the camp. Prisoners tried to help each other in small ways, sharing food, passing messages, offering comfort. These acts were dangerous, but they preserved a sense of humanity in an environment designed to destroy it. Some prisoners sabotaged work when possible, risking brutal retaliation. Outside the camp, the local population was aware of its existence. Smoke, noise, and transport movements were visible. Some civilians tried to help by smuggling food or passing information, though doing so was extremely dangerous. Others looked away, fearful or unsure how to respond. Camp Vught stood as a constant reminder of occupation and repression. By mid-1943, deportations from Camp Vught intensified. Trains carried Jewish prisoners eastward, most often to extermination camps where survival chances were minimal. Families were torn apart. Parents were separated from children. People were told they were being relocated for work, but rumors spread quickly. Fear grew with every transport. The camp was not static. Its function and population shifted over time as Nazi priorities changed. As Allied forces advanced and the war situation worsened for Germany, Camp Vught became increasingly chaotic and violent. Guards grew more nervous and aggressive. Punishments became harsher. Executions increased. Camp Vught was not just a place of imprisonment. It was a tool of terror, control, and dehumanization. It showed how the Nazi system could reproduce its brutality even outside Germany itself. The camp's existence shattered any illusion that the Netherlands had been spared the worst horrors of the concentration camp system. This is only the beginning of Camp Vught's story. The events that followed would include mass punishment, deportation, execution, and moments that still shock historians today. In the next part, we will look more closely at daily life inside the camp, the experiences of prisoners, and the event that would forever define Camp Vught in Dutch collective memory. Life inside Camp Vught followed a rigid, merciless rhythm designed to exhaust both body and mind. Each day began before sunrise with shouting, whistles, and blows against barrack doors. Prisoners scrambled from wooden bunks stacked 3 levels high, often sharing a single blanket among several people. There was little room to move. The air was stale, filled with the smell of sweat, sickness, and unwashed bodies. Privacy did not exist. From the moment prisoners woke up, they were under constant surveillance, aware that any delay or mistake could lead to punishment. Roll call was one of the most feared parts of the day. Prisoners were forced to stand in formation for hours while guards counted and recounted them. Weather did not matter. Rain soaked clothing through. Winter cold froze fingers and toes. Summer heat caused people to collapse. Anyone who fell was beaten or dragged away. If the numbers did not match, the entire group suffered. Roll call was not about accuracy. It was about control, humiliation, and breaking resistance. After roll call came work. Forced labor defined survival in Camp Vught. Prisoners were assigned to work details regardless of age, health, or strength. Some worked inside the camp, repairing buildings, cleaning latrines, or carrying heavy materials. Others were sent outside the camp to nearby factories producing equipment for the German war effort. The workdays were long, exhausting, and dangerous. Guards pushed prisoners constantly, screaming insults and striking anyone who slowed down. Accidents were common, and medical care was minimal or non-existent. Food was deliberately inadequate. Breakfast might consist of a bitter liquid meant to resemble coffee. Lunch was usually watery soup with barely any nutrients. Dinner included a small piece of bread, sometimes accompanied by a thin slice of sausage or margarine. Hunger was constant. Prisoners thought about food obsessively. Conversations revolved around meals from the past or imagined feasts. Starvation weakened bodies and clouded minds, making resistance increasingly difficult. Disease spread quickly. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and malnutrition created perfect conditions for illness. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and skin infections were common. Prisoners who became too weak to work were considered useless. Some were sent to the camp infirmary, where conditions were often as deadly as the camp itself. Others were simply removed, deported, or left to die. Violence was unpredictable. Guards could beat prisoners for no clear reason. Punishments were often public, designed to terrorize others into obedience. Prisoners learned to avoid eye contact, to move quickly but not too quickly, to speak only when spoken to. Even silence could be interpreted as defiance. Fear shaped every movement, every decision. Despite this, small acts of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared crumbs of bread, whispered encouragement, or helped each other stand during roll call. These gestures were risky but vital. They reminded prisoners that they were still human in a system determined to erase that fact. Solidarity became a quiet form of resistance. One of the darkest symbols of Camp Vught was the punishment bunker. This concrete structure contained tiny cells designed to isolate and torment prisoners. Being sent to the bunker was a terrifying prospect. Cells were dark, cramped, and poorly ventilated. Prisoners were often denied food, water, or the ability to lie down. Time lost meaning inside those walls. In January 1944, the bunker became the site of one of the most infamous crimes committed in Camp Vught. After a confrontation involving female prisoners, the SS decided to carry out a collective punishment. 74 women were forced into a single small cell overnight. The cell was never meant to hold that many people. There was almost no air. The door was sealed. As the hours passed, panic set in. Women screamed, clawed at the walls, and begged for air. Some fainted. Others were trampled as people struggled to breathe. Guards ignored the noise. By morning, 10 women were dead. Many others were permanently injured. The event became known as the bunker tragedy. The deaths caused shock even within the Nazi system. The incident was so extreme that it drew unwanted attention from higher authorities. An investigation followed, not out of compassion, but because the SS feared losing control of its image and discipline. The camp commandant was eventually removed, though the system itself remained unchanged. No real justice was served. For prisoners, the bunker tragedy confirmed what they already knew. Their lives had no value to their captors. Death could come not only through execution or deportation, but through sheer indifference. The bunker stood as a warning to everyone in the camp. Obedience was mandatory. Survival was never guaranteed. Children in Camp Vught witnessed all of this. Some were forced to work. Others wandered the camp under constant fear. Parents struggled to protect them, often at great personal risk. When children cried from hunger or terror, guards responded with violence. Childhood ended quickly behind barbed wire. Deportations continued throughout this period. Jewish prisoners were regularly selected and placed on transports heading east. Families were torn apart with little warning. Prisoners were told to pack belongings they would never see again. Many understood what deportation meant, even if they could not fully grasp the scale of what awaited them. As the war turned against Germany, tension inside the camp increased. Guards became more brutal, more unpredictable. Rumours spread among prisoners about Allied advances. Hope flickered, but so did fear. The SS knew time was running out, and that knowledge made them even more dangerous. Camp Vught was no longer just a place of imprisonment. It had become a pressure cooker of violence, desperation, and uncertainty. Every day tested the limits of endurance. Survival depended on luck, strength, and the fragile support of others. In the next part, we will follow the final phase of Camp Vught's operation, the evacuations, executions, and deportations that marked its end, and what happened to the prisoners as the Nazis attempted to erase evidence of their crimes. By early 1944, it was clear that the war was turning against Nazi Germany. Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts, and rumours reached even the most isolated prisoners. Inside Camp Vught, this shift did not bring immediate relief. Instead, it marked the beginning of the camp's most dangerous phase. As defeat became more likely, the SS focused on maintaining control, extracting as much forced labour as possible, and eliminating witnesses who might survive to tell what had happened. The camp population changed rapidly. Jewish prisoners were deported in large numbers to extermination camps in the east. Many transports left Camp Vught under heavy guard, carrying men, women, and children who would never return. Those who remained increasingly consisted of political prisoners, resistance members, and forced labourers considered useful to the German war effort. Fear intensified as prisoners realized that the camp was being emptied not for liberation but for destruction elsewhere. Executions became more frequent. Resistance members and hostages were taken out of the camp and shot in nearby forests or execution grounds. These killings were often carried out in retaliation for acts of resistance outside the camp. Prisoners knew that they could be killed not for anything they had done, but for actions taken by others. This policy of terror was meant to suppress resistance by making the cost unbearable. Forced labour reached its peak. Prisoners were driven harder than ever, even as their bodies weakened from hunger and disease. Some were sent to factories producing weapons and aircraft components. Others dug trenches or repaired infrastructure damaged by Allied bombings. Exhaustion was constant. Collapsing at work could mean a beating or removal from the work detail, which often led to deportation or death. As Allied bombing raids increased, Camp Vught itself was affected. Air raid sirens became part of daily life. Prisoners were sometimes forced to remain outside during alarms, while guards sought shelter. Bombs fell nearby, shaking barracks and sending waves of fear through the camp. Some prisoners hoped the camp would be destroyed, ending their suffering. Others feared being buried alive or shot in the chaos. In June 1944, the SS began preparing to close the camp. Rather than free the prisoners, they planned evacuations designed to preserve forced labour and conceal crimes. Records were destroyed. Evidence of executions and abuse was removed where possible. The goal was not mercy, but erasure. Large groups of prisoners were transferred to other concentration camps in Germany. These transports were brutal. Prisoners were packed into overcrowded trains with little food or water. Many died en route. Those who arrived were sent directly into new systems of terror, often worse than Camp Vught. For many, survival chances grew even smaller. One of the most infamous events during this final phase was the execution of resistance prisoners just before evacuation. Groups were taken away under the pretense of transfer and instead murdered. These killings were calculated acts meant to silence those who could testify about camp conditions and SS crimes. Children were among the deported. Some were separated from their parents during evacuations. Others were transported together, clinging to family members in terror. Few survived the camps they were sent to. For parents, the knowledge that evacuation did not mean safety was a crushing psychological blow. By September 1944, Camp Vught was largely emptied of prisoners. When Allied forces finally reached the area, they did not find a liberated camp filled with survivors, but an abandoned site marked by traces of suffering. The barracks stood silent. The fences remained. The ground itself seemed to carry memory. Liberation did not bring immediate closure. Survivors carried trauma that could not be erased. Many returned home to find families gone, homes destroyed, or communities unwilling to listen. Some spoke about Camp Vught immediately. Others remained silent for decades. The camp had not only imprisoned bodies, but also fractured lives. For the Netherlands, the existence of Camp Vught forced a reckoning. The idea that a full SS concentration camp had operated on Dutch soil challenged national narratives of resistance and victimhood. Questions emerged about collaboration, silence, and responsibility. These questions would echo long after the war ended. Camp Vught did not disappear after 1944. The site continued to be used, first by Allied forces and later for other purposes. But its identity had already been sealed. It was a place where the Nazi system revealed itself clearly, without distance or abstraction. It showed that extreme cruelty did not require remote locations. It could exist near villages, roads, and ordinary lives. In the final part, we will look at what Camp Vught became after the war, how it is remembered today, and why its story remains essential in understanding both the Holocaust and the dangers of forgetting. When the war ended, Camp Vught did not simply fade into history. The physical structures remained, and with them the weight of what had happened. Barbed wire, watchtowers, and barracks still stood, silent witnesses to terror that words could barely describe. For survivors, returning to ordinary life proved far more difficult than liberation itself. The camp had ended, but its presence followed them everywhere. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the site of Camp Vught was reused. Former prisoners of war, collaborators, and later refugees were held there. This reuse created a complicated legacy. The same fences that once confined victims of Nazi terror now surrounded others, sometimes blurring public understanding of what the camp had originally been. For many survivors, seeing the camp repurposed without clear acknowledgement of its past felt like a second erasure. Silence dominated the early post-war years. Survivors struggled with trauma, guilt, and grief. Many felt that their experiences were too heavy to share, or that no one wanted to hear them. Others tried to speak but encountered disbelief or discomfort. Dutch society focused on rebuilding, often preferring stories of resistance over stories of suffering, collaboration, and complicity. Camp Vught did not fit easily into heroic narratives. Children who survived the camp carried invisible wounds. Their memories were fragmented, shaped by fear and confusion. Many grew up without parents who had been deported and murdered. Others were raised by adults who themselves were deeply traumatized. The camp shaped their lives in ways that were not always recognized or understood, even decades later. Over time, attitudes began to change. As survivors aged, the urgency to preserve their testimonies grew. Historians, educators, and former prisoners pushed for recognition of Camp Vught as a place of historical truth. Gradually, the camp was transformed into a memorial and museum. This transformation was not automatic or uncontested. It required confronting uncomfortable questions about responsibility, indifference, and the reality of Nazi terror in Western Europe. Today, Camp Vught stands as a place of remembrance. Visitors walk paths once patrolled by guards. They stand where roll calls took place, where children waited, where prisoners feared the bunker. The silence now invites reflection rather than terror. Yet the absence of noise does not mean absence of meaning. Every structure carries memory. Remembering Camp Vught is not only about honoring the victims, it is also about understanding how such a place could exist in a society that considered itself civilized. The camp was not hidden deep in enemy territory. It operated near towns and roads, in full view of the outside world. Its existence forces a confrontation with the dangers of normalization, obedience, and silence. Camp Vught shows how systems of cruelty rely not only on fanatics, but on ordinary people performing ordinary tasks. Guards followed orders, administrators processed paperwork, trains ran on schedule. The machinery of oppression functioned efficiently because enough people allowed it to function. This is one of the most unsettling lessons of the camp. For future generations, Camp Vught remains a warning. It teaches that human rights are fragile, that dehumanization can become routine, and that extreme violence does not begin with mass murder, but with exclusion, labeling, and indifference. The camp did not appear overnight. It was built step by step, decision by decision. Survivors often said that remembering was a responsibility, not a choice. As their voices fade, the responsibility shifts to those who come after. Camp Vught demands attention not because it is unique, but because it is an example of what can happen anywhere when power goes unchecked and empathy is abandoned. The story of Camp Vught is not only about the past, it speaks to the present and the future. It asks how societies treat the vulnerable, how authority is questioned, and how easily fear can override morality. Remembering is not about guilt alone, it is about vigilance. Camp Vught was a place where humanity was tested and often failed. But it was also a place where small acts of courage survived against overwhelming odds. Those acts matter. They remind us that even in the darkest systems, choices still exist. This is why Camp Vught must be remembered, not as a distant horror, but as a human story, one that warns, challenges, and demands that we pay attention, so that what happened behind those fences is never repeated. Camp Vught was not an isolated moment in history. It was the result of choices, silence, obedience, and fear, unfolding step by step until cruelty became routine and suffering became invisible. Remembering places like this is not about dwelling in darkness, it is about understanding how easily it can return when we stop paying attention. The people who suffered here were not symbols or numbers. They were ordinary men, women, and children whose lives were cut apart by a system that thrived on dehumanization. Telling these stories matters because memory fades, and when memory fades, the space for denial and distortion grows. At History in the Trenches, this channel exists to confront history as it truly was, not as we wish it had been. These are not comfortable stories, but they are necessary ones. They remind us that history is not distant, and its consequences are not abstract. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something new, take a moment to support the channel. Like this video so it reaches others who care about understanding the past. Share it with someone who believes history should be faced honestly. And subscribe to History in the Trenches if you want more in-depth documentaries that go beyond surface-level narratives and into the realities people actually lived through. Because history is not just about dates and events, it is about choices, consequences, and responsibility. And the more we understand what happened in places like Camp Vught, the better prepared we are to recognize the warning signs when they appear again.